Good afternoon, everyone out there on the interwebs. My name is Jared, and this is my channel, Mazda B3K. Today is the start of a major three-part project, which is a powertrain swap for my brother's old 2010 Ford Fusion. The transmission is dying on it, and we got a new transmission. The engine is still in pretty good shape, but it doesn't make sense to have a almost a 250,000 mile engine, 222,000 miles, coupled to a transmission that only has about 30. So we went ahead and we got an engine that has about 43,000 miles on it, which for a Duratec 3.0 is basically brand new. This video is going to be divided into three parts. Part 1 is the removal of the old powertrain, and in case you don't know, powertrain is a term referring to the engine and the transmission together. Powertrain. The removal of the powertrain. Part 2 is going to be the preparing of the new powertrain, including connecting the transmission to the new engine, because those came from two different salvage yards, so we still have to do that work. And part 3 is going to be the reinstallation or the installation of the new powertrain and the shakedown cruise. So without further ado, let's get started. So we are officially started on the teardown for the swap. First thing to come out is the air intake. Should just be, what is it, 1/8 millimeter? Or Phillips.
A flathead screwdriver. Take both clamps loose on this guy. This is the airbox end. This is the throttle body end. You want to take that loose so you can unlock this PCV hose. Okay, this one, the valve's on the back of the block.
Before we go any further, and really this should have been the first thing to do, but it was kind of a no harm done. You got to disconnect the electrical.
Right here.
You don't want to accidentally touch something to something, cause an arc, fry a sensor, fry yourself.
I hate dealing with that, so I take.
In fact, probably just to give us more elbow room.
Yeah, I'm taking the battery.
We can take the battery out. Though I suggest before you try to lift the battery, we need to take the hood off, because that needs to happen.
Well, this strut reinforcing bar is going to have to get out of the way too. We've got an aftermarket strut tower reinforcing bar right here because I like to drive aggressively. So these are, I believe, 14 millimeter. You just take them loose, lift the whole thing out of the way, set it to the side.
So that's one side there, other side here.
Battery terminals on this are 8 millimeter. This is a ratcheting box. Really awesome tool. Well worth the price of the kit.
And once this is out of the way, we're going to lift the hood out. That's four 10 millimeter bolts. And there's some extra steps you have to do before you do that, so that way you can put the hood back on in one piece. And I'll bring you back when we get there. So we got the bar out. A good pro tip is, if you're not going to put fasteners in bags and label them, or in bins, or however you want to do it, put the fastener back where it went, so that way it doesn't disappear. That is critically important when you're doing really, really big jobs. Also particularly important if you can't focus all of your time on the job. Meaning, this may take a week, 2 weeks, hopefully just a few days, but it really depends on how much work my brother and I, how much time we can put towards it. So, I reiterate, come up with a storage system or put the fasteners back where they came from so you don't lose them.
This one got stripped out by acid, but yeah, it's got like no pressure on it.
Alright, so this is the battery hold down, and since my brother mentioned that, I'll see if I can't snag a functioning hold down from the junkyard next time I go. But the hold down doesn't really do much holding these days. As he said, some battery acid leaked in and
it also got broken at some
fried
point.
it. This car's had a rough life. So anyway,
I think it's not this bolt, it's the threads at the bottom, so it's probably the battery tray you actually need to get.
Okay, duly noted, battery tray. So, fortunately, that battery has a go handle, so that wasn't too bad. And now, battery's out of the way. That's going to create some more real estate. So we're working on the battery tray right now. Nominally, this should be some 10mm nuts, though we've got one that's been damaged by battery acid, so it's more of like a 9-ish. That's what we're using to get it out. Alright, with the battery tray removed, that gets you access to an engine mount over here. Future Jared here. It's noted later in the video, but I wanted to go ahead and put this correction in now. What you're looking at right there is a transmission mount, not an engine mount. Duratec 3.0, when put in a 2010 Ford Fusion, has 2 engine mounts. One of them is the dog bone. One of them is on the passenger side of the vehicle. The mount on the driver's side of the vehicle is a transmission mount. Back to the regularly scheduled program. And then if we come over here, we've got access to the other engine mount here. Not much going on there. And once we get it up in the air and we pull some other stuff and drain some fluids, the dog bone mount, which is kind of in the bottom in the center, is that right?
Yep.
Bottom center, we'll have access to, and this vehicle only has 3 mounts. We had a little powwow, and our order of operations is we're going to get the fuse box, which is the big black box by his hand, out of the way, and we're going to get this electrical out of the way so that we have access to the motor mount that is right here. And technically it's not a motor mount, it's a transmission mount, because that's what it's plugged into. And once we have all that clear, the next step is we're going to drain coolant. To that end, I have prepared a catch pan because we're going to reuse the coolant. And before you do that, you want to make sure this is as clean as possible, because otherwise you're introducing contaminants into your coolant. And we'll get this under the petcock, which is a drain that's built into the radiator for this specific purpose. And we'll drain her out. And once we're drained out, we're going to get her in the air so we can get access to some stuff from the bottom. See, that is a 10?
Yes, sir.
Alright, so we're getting this ground strap out of the way.
You've got,
oh wait,
this is for the fuse box, so you've got bolts here, 10 here, and then under this thing, way down there, you've got a nut on a post. And I believe it is also a 10. Let me see if I can. Pass me the flathead. Okay, so I managed to get this off. The trick is, this is a little retention mechanism that slides into this notch, and there'll be a little gap right there. You need to get your flathead screwdriver and pry up while pushing toward the fender. Pop off, pull it out of the way, and you can get down to this thing, which is a 10mm nut on a post. Even when you take it loose, it's still in the way.
Folks who have been watching the channel for a while might be wondering why my brother's doing all the wrenching here. And that is because he is the subject matter expert, the SME, on the Duratec 3.0. He drove this car for over 10 years. He has had it in various states of assembly, disassembly, disrepair, and repair over that 10 years. So I am letting him take the lead on getting this thing apart and lending my expertise and just overall engine swap knowledge, as I have done one in the past. And we're also both kind of learning together, because this is the first time either of us has done a swap on a Duratec 3.0 in a front wheel drive. So we've wiggled this loose, and there's just enough clearance to get at these 2 bolts right there. Someone's going to have to hold up the fuse box so we can do it. So with that done, we're turning our attention over here to the petcock on the radiator, which is that red cap right there. So the idea is we can just unscrew this, coolant will start to dribble out. It's not fast, but it's a controlled release of coolant. We can catch it. And we've made the decision that we can't quite get the coolant jug clean enough, so we'll probably just put some new in. Coolant's not terribly expensive, so we'll go from there. So we've got the coolant drained out. The focus now is to separate the cooling system from the block and to create some room in the back next to the firewall, so that when we go to lift this thing out, it'll actually lift. And to that extent, brother here is taking this bolt out to separate the EGR, just to create a little bit of wiggle room so we can lift this out. And meanwhile, I have taken my ear clamp pliers, and I have pulled this back, and we're going to work on, that just popped and got me, and work on getting this loose from the, looks like the thermostat housing up in here. So that is what we are up to at the moment, and then we're also going to have to separate the lower radiator hose out, and we will have to drain the oil here pretty soon, and then separate the oil cooler lines out of the front as well. When you've got a hose that's been on for a while, what can happen is it doesn't rust well, but it gets pretty firmly stuck. You can try wiggling it, but if that doesn't break it loose, a tool like a pick is really handy. Get the pick in and under, get it to lift, and then you spray in some silicone spray and let that kind of work its way in, and then try to wiggle it again. See what that earns you. Silicone spray tends to loosen things up.
You're gonna need to give it some time.
Yep, and if time doesn't work, you take your pick, get all the way back under, and just kind of move it around the perimeter or the circumference and break it loose, and then you should be able to get the hose out pretty easily.
Give me that thing. I'm gonna spray it again.
Little update. So we went ahead and we got the upper and lower radiator hoses out of the way, and what that enabled us to do is to get at the shifter linkage at the top of the transmission. This is the prawl that actually controls what gear you're in, that does the shifting to the inside of the transmission. And we went ahead and popped off the connection to the floor shifter inside the cab so that we can continue to work on lifting. And what we'll do,
These heater hoses are gonna have to come off too.
is we can pop this loose back there, that connector right here.
Yeah, there's a two 10mm, or actually those might be 12s.
Okay, so we can
on
pull
this
the bracket.
plate, yeah.
We'll pull the bracket out so we don't have to lift that particular connector out. Then we can pull the entire linkage out of the way, so as we can continue to make room to lift this thing out. As we continue to separate things, our next target are the heater core hoses, upper and lower. So we are working on that.
We've already used the radiator hose clamp tool, which if you don't have this, I really recommend you go buy one if you do a lot of shade tree stuff where you touch cooling system. They are so much better than vice grips for dealing with these fussy radiator clamps. It actually has a cup and a slot for grabbing the
Basically
point.
a tooth.
Yeah. It was well worth, I think we gave 25 bucks after tax for these, and they have definitely paid for themselves.
Yep. So we're going to work on getting those two hoses out as we continue to work on separating stuff. Alright, next stop is the hood, and this is covered in one of my earlier videos when we rebuilt the front clip and replaced this, but we've got a pair of, I think they're 10mm there, 10mm down there, and we also, you got to pull the wiper fluid tube loose from the hood. Now we need to mark these with something, or just go ahead and be okay with realigning it when we go to put it back on, which we may just do because the alignment we did was slapdash. It works, but it's kind of me. So anyway, if you want to keep the exact alignment, if you're perfect if you're happy with how your hood lays out, take a Sharpie, take a paint pen, and trace the outline of the bracket. You can see where I had tried in the past with a purple Sharpie. Trace the outline of the bracket. You'll see it on the hood, so you can just line things up, and then you're good to go. So we've got a loose EGR at this point. We're working on pulling some vacuum lines out of the way.
Yeah, this is a main vacuum line. Pulls vacuum out of the intake plumbing right here. It's got to go. If we haven't already set it, you also got to take two bolts from the EGR loose. There's one, the bolt head was right there. And immediately on the other side of this protrusion right here, there's another 10mm bolt. It runs through to another nut. It's welded on.
But mainly what's going on here is we've got to create some clearance next to the firewall so that we can lift this out. Because it's very, very tight. Okay, next step, fuel lines. Now, normally along the top of the fuel rail, there's going to be a Schrader valve, which is used to relieve any fuel pressure that's in the fuel system. This is the correct way.
Has a little cap on it.
Has a cutesy little cap like you see on a bicycle Schrader valve. Another way you can do this is just simply separate the fuel line here. It's going to spew on you for a second and then done. So let's see if we got any pressure here. To do this, take your, let me zoom in. Thank you. Take your flathead, just push down on the valve core in the center of the Schrader, and it'll go blip. And turns out the system was already pretty depressurized. Not really anything coming out. Alright, we were doing some thinking about how exactly we're going to get this out with the tools at hand, and essentially what we came to is that we need to take the upper air intake, also known as the plenum, which is this guy here. It's going to need to come out. Alright, as you see, we already have it out, but it's just a string of 8mm. And there's one up here. Make sure that you disconnect the electrical that goes in there, and that's it. It'll come out providing you've pulled all the vacuum lines that are here and here. There's an electrical that goes there, and
electrical there, vacuum there.
Okay, electrical there and vacuum there. Get all that out, plenum comes right out.
This is the line that comes from the fuel tank.
So, okay, we got the other valve cover off, and now we're going to start working on things below so that we can lift. Specifically, the transmission is going to be connected to the CV axles, which in turn are connected to the wheels, because those are essentially drive shafts up front. So those got to come out. So we've lifted the vehicle up. We're supported on jack stands. Make sure that you've got your parking brake on before you do this so that it can't roll back on you as you lift. And then once you do finish lifting, give her the old shimmy shake. Make sure your jack stands are solid before you get under there and start messing around with stuff. We've already done that. Everything looks good. So we're going to start the process of taking off wheels and popping the axle nut so that we can remove the driver and passenger CV axles. We are under the vehicle. This is the oil pan, and I'll bring this around. There's the drain bolt. It is a 15mm. We've got a pan in position. Go ahead and crack that, drain it, and then we're going to pick this up tomorrow because we have stuff and things that we need to do. Good morning, everyone. It is the next day. I finished up with draining the oil last night, and now we are preparing to take off wheels and remove CV axles. Swung by the local auto parts store this morning. Grabbed a new driver CV axle. That was something that needed to be replaced. That was on our to-do list, so we're going to go ahead and do it now, since we have to pull the CV axles anyway to do an engine out. So the lug nuts are 19mm. I suggest that if you've got an impact driver, use one. We're going to pop these wheels off, and then this center axle nut also has to come out. And you have to, as you can see, you're supposed to dent it in to keep it from breaking loose, so you have to undo the dent and get it out. And I hope that the new axle comes with a new nut, otherwise we're going to have to reuse this one. So we're going to get working, and then we'll bring you back when we got some more stuff to report. Alright, real quick, I wanted to show you guys, we need to take the calipers off because we have to get the rotor off. To do that, there is a pair of 15mm bolts around here on the back. Just kind of swing that around. I hope the camera's catching that, where I have the ratchet and everything. After that is done, we have these Torx, which I think are like a T25 or a T30. They actually hold the rotor in position. Rotor is this big disc thing here. So we got one of those to take out, and then we'll be down to the axle nut, and we can start focusing on pulling this passenger CV. We may have to loosen up the tie rod to give us some more degree of rotation. We'll have to see. It depends how much of a fight this turns into. Hey guys, back very briefly. Just want to let you know this is a T30. What you need right there. Next up is the axle nut. That is going to be a 32mm. I recommend that you get something, an impact socket on it, so that you can bring extra power to bear. Okay, so as you can see, got the axle nut off. If you're doing this with the front tires in the air like we are, you have to use an impact tool. If you're on the ground, you can use a breaker bar, but we got it off. So the way that we know to get the CV axles out, you have to over rotate the knuckle. And in order to do that, the tie rod has to come off. Future Jared here. Tie rod does not need to come out. Correct method will be explained further in the video. Tie rod, at least for our application, is a 19 millimeter, and it's got a retaining pin that you got to pull out. And then we're going to take the jack and lift this up, because right now when you look at the angle between the threaded post and the rod itself, it's at a funky angle, so it's not going to want to come out. So we'll lift it up until we can get that out, and then we can do the rotation, and then we can pull the CV out. Alright, we got the passenger CV out. It fought pretty hard. What we found is that hyperextending the knuckle really wasn't getting it done. So we took a pickle fork, or this is actually specifically a CV removal tool, and I placed it.
Got an angle on it. That's the shim.
Yeah, well, anyway, there's a CV removal tool right there. Kind of looks like a pickle fork that you use for ball joints and stuff, but sizing's different. And what I had to do is knock it in where it joins into the transmission, or not the transmission, the extension shaft to get it to the transmission. And I dented in this little cosmetic cup. That's not a big deal. And I was able to slide it off of the extension and then drop it down. And once we had that, we could wiggle it out. The problem, and we found this as we were working on this, is this boot is torn. And that's pretty disappointing, as this is a very new part. It probably has less than 1,000 miles on it. And we know that we didn't tear it, at least not right this very moment, because there's evidence of grease that's been slung on the back side of the knuckle. So this has been torn for a while. We're going to see if we can't use the warranty from the local parts store that we bought it from, get a replacement. So when you're pulling these out, we're not sure if it's the culprit, but try not to hyperextend these boots. I don't think they make them like they used to, and they're very susceptible to tearing. So either way, we got to buy a new one, or we're going to get this swapped, because this, in order to get these boots off and back on, you basically have to take the CV axle apart. So I'm not considering a boot swap for these, because I also don't know how long it's been slinging grease and the condition of the U-joint that's inside of the boot. So now we're going to move on to the driver's side. Alright, so we have the driver axle out, and this one was old, and this one we're replacing, so I was willing to be kind of mean to it. Here's the thing. You can't really hyperextend it out. You don't even really need to take the tie rod out. What we found is the correct way to do this is to take the top of the knuckle off, let it pull forward, and then loosen up this ABS thing. Actually, that one right there is kind of, you loosen up the ABS thing like that, and the knuckle can extend really far forward, and then it'll come right out. So that is definitely the way to do the driver. Passenger, you can kind of sneak off, but the end of the driver axle on the transmission side, which is this side here, it's a male. So you can't kind of slip it off like you can on the passenger side. But really, the correct way to do this on both sides, pull the top of the knuckle, pull the knuckle forward, you get the room you need, and it'll come right out. Alright, so at this point, with the CV axles out of the way and the wheels off, and we've taken most of the harness loose, and we've cleared out chunks of the engine bay so we can get to the mounts, we're going to start pulling the mounts. Before you do this, you probably want to drain the transmission if you have not done so already. That's going to be an 11 millimeter bolt. That is right there. You may recognize it if you've seen my transmission video on the Transit Connect. Same kind of deal. It's a 6F35 transmission. That little bolt, pull it out, let it pee out, plug it. We're not saving the transmission fluid as this one's dying. We don't know what kind of fun things might be floating in it. We're going to use fresh fluid. But yeah, we're going to go after mounts. We've got one other thing we did do. I don't know if we recorded it yet. Is the exhaust has been taken out at that point. Hopefully we can lift everything else out without having to take it apart further. If we have to, I'll film that so that we can do that. Exhaust wasn't too bad for us, but that's because it's been off, I think, recent-ishly. If you've never done this, you're going to need to get some kind of knocker loose, some kind of penetrating oil, let it sit, and pray a little bit, because exhaust bolts and fasteners are notorious for rust welding and snapping and all other sorts of fun things. Okay, so what you see here is we have set up the engine crane that I have with an engine balancer. That's what the yellow thing is with the crank. We have that screwed in. Zoom in here. That is screwed in with some washers to help distribute the weight, screwed into where the plenum goes. And we need this to take weight as we start taking the mounts out, and ultimately to lift the whole package out and get her up and away. Alrighty. We are taking this mount loose from the unibody here. There are 2 bolts up top, and then there are another 2 bolts that are kind of on the side. There's one you can get at from the top over here. That's in picture. And then the last one, the one that's further back, I had to get hopefully this doesn't rotate in a funny way. I had to grab it from the underside, and it was about right there. I had to sneak my arm through where the CV axle is, so you can't really do this until the CV axle's out. That's where you need to go. So now we're going to move on either to the dog bone or to the mount that's actually on the engine proper. These were 13 millimeter bolts. There's 4 of them. Moving on. Okay, so on the mount that's on the engine block side, it's right here. It's a 21 millimeter. You're going to need an extension. Wow. Okay. And you may have to use a breaker bar. It's in there pretty tight. They use blue Loctite to hold it in there. Get that out. Loosen these right here, because we're going to loosen the AC lines up here so we can pull them back in this direction, so we don't have to try to loose them, the cooler lines up from at the radiator, which would be significantly more difficult. Loosen this one here, same thing. You just want to get the AC lines loose. There is a power connector for the electric fans on the radiator. It's right here. Pretty straightforward. Push back here, pull out. And next step for us is to loosen up these AC lines here. Before you go pulling AC lines, understand you need to have evacuated all the Freon. You can't do that at home, not legally, unless you got the right equipment. So I took this to a local mechanic. He took his fancy machine, vacuumed all the Freon out, and is holding it, basically holding it for me until we get this done, and then he'll recharge it, and then I pay him. But again, do not try to drain this at home. If you have not drained it, stop right here. You're going to have to get this vehicle to somebody with the correct machine. You can't just use a vacuum pump. That won't work. It has to be a proper Freon evacuation machine, recovery machine, whatever you want to call it. Get it done right. Freon is a really, really horrendously nasty greenhouse gas. We do not want it escaping. Do it right, get it in a capture vessel, and then all will be well. Okay, so you'll notice we've got the AC lines wrapped up in bags. That's because it's important you keep contaminants out of the lines. This is a fairly easy way to do that. You just take a Ziploc bag, put it in there, take a rubber band, tape, whatever you got, seal it off. It'll last long enough until you get everything back together. And this will keep it all clean so that when you take it back to the mechanic, they're not going to have any issues recharging the system with Freon. Onwards. Okay, we have started trying the lift, and one thing we found out pretty quick is we needed some room. So we took the radiator shroud / fan out, and it sits in these little push clips here. There's 2 of them, one on each side. Push in the top part and lift to get it out of the bracket, and then you just have to fight and wiggle it out past everything to get it out. The dog bone that is on the under the firewall in the middle, that is a 15 millimeter, and we have that out. So we're going to keep on lifting, and as things pop up that we missed, we're just going to loosen them and keep going. One of the things we're going to have to move is the mounts for the airbox. See, there's this piece here. One of these mounts is down here, and that is very much in the way. The transmission cooler lines are going to hit it. The good news is it's held in by 2 10 millimeter bolts, one there and one right there, and then it should just lift out of the way. I don't even have to take it out, so I don't have to take that plastic runner out. But now we have real estate and we can continue the lift. Alright, so we realized we had yet to pull the transmission cooler lines. We determined the easiest place to do it was on the radiator side, so we took care of that. There are 2. There's one up top, one towards the bottom there. They are both 16 millimeter. They come out pretty easy. We also pulled this top AC line off the block there. That one goes down to the compressor, which is buried at the bottom of the accessory setup at the near the bottom of the block. So that way this line will be able to rise up with the engine as we move it. We're going to change position here on the engine leveler. There's a couple of adjuster holes. We're moving to the outermost to get a bit better, more even spread. And once that's reconfigured, we're going to start our lifting process again, because we've kind of cleared everything out that we see as a potential obstruction at this time. Okay, we have removed the coolant overflow reservoir because we were concerned about stress being put on the harness from the ABS module, the ABS pump. So it's a pair of 10 millimeters. There's a 10 millimeter nut I actually need to screw back on. And there is a 10 millimeter bolt. It goes right here. And then there's another one of those ear clamps that you got to move, get the hose out of the way. And then for the ABS module itself, the electrical, this piece here is actually hinged. You squeeze these tabs when it's in the lock position, and then you pull up, the whole connector rotates up, and then it locks in like this. This is the open position, and then you just pull it right out. So we got that out of the way. We're going to continue to lift and keep an eye out for anything that's coming under tension, and we'll bring you back if there's anything else of note. We decided to go ahead and remove the transmission mount. We didn't do it earlier because it was been hard to get to. We went ahead and did it now because it's going to make it much easier to get this whole assembly out past the fuse box without damaging the plastic of the fuse box. So that's a 19 millimeter. If you've got an impact, that works out really well because there's a catch on the nut that goes on one side. You get that to pin against something, and then zoop, it comes right out. So we're going to keep pumping, keep lifting, see what we get. Okay, we had to remove the other end of the AC line at the compressor because otherwise it would have broken off this nipple on the radiator, and that would have meant a new radiator, which is no bueno. That was a 10mm bolt. It's quite tricky to remove, but we got it. Here is the whole line assembly. I've got bags on either end. We'll get some more rubber bands and tighten them up. As soon as we get the engine clear, we will put rags or something in the holes in the compressor, because this compressor is intended to be reused, and it's absolutely imperative that you keep the system clean. As you can see, we've almost got it out. We're really close. So far so good. Only thing to do is keep going upward. All right, so here we are. Now we have reached the max extension on our crane. We cannot lift any higher. And so what we're going to have to do is partially rebuild the wheels, or the knuckle, so that we can get the wheels back on, and we're just going to lower the vehicle. That should give us the clearance we need to swing this entire assembly out. We've got one last point of connection right here. So we're gonna take a couple of nuts loose here, and that should separate the two harnesses. So it turns out there's a couple of things we did not need to disconnect that we now know. The ECU doesn't need to be disconnected. The tie rods don't need to be disconnected. This ABS module does not need to be disconnected. We weren't sure where the breakout points were on the harness, and what would come out, what would stay, so on and so forth. So most of your breakout, by breakout I mean that lets the engine part of the harness break away from the other parts of the harness that service the ABS, that service headlights and fog lights and turn signals and all that good stuff. And most of that is here. And we took that apart very early in the process. So we're going to go ahead, we're going to take this apart. That'll get us free and clear over there. And then we're going to put the wheels back together. And I'll bring you back when we've got a vehicle back on the ground and a free swinging powertrain. Alright guys, as you can see, it is out. We had to put the vehicle back on the wheels to get the extra height we needed. We didn't put the calipers on, but we did reconnect all the elements of the knuckle, the tie rod, and the upper control arm, so that bad things would not happen when we put it back on the ground. And once we did that, we had to finagle the transmission cooler lines around a bit, but we got them off. They'll need to come completely off so we can flush them before we reconnect them to the new transmission. That's it. It is out. And this probably is where I'm going to end part 1 of the video, just getting this out. And part 2 is going to pick up where we start swapping over the necessary components to our new block, and we get the new block on the stand and get everything prepped to put the new powertrain back in. Alright guys, that is the end of part 1, which is the removal of the old powertrain. If you've got some comments, good or bad, please leave them. I'm always looking for feedback so I can improve. Please like, share, and subscribe. And also stay tuned for part 2, which all of this has already been recorded. I just need to do editing and such. And I'll probably release these on a little bit of a schedule versus all at once, because it takes time to make this content, and I want to try to keep a regular flow of things. But in any case, stay tuned for part 2, and I will see you later.